Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the most dangerous man in organized crime doesn't carry a gun, doesn't raise his voice, and doesn't need to. He just thinks, quietly, efficiently, and far ahead of anyone trying to stop him. Imagine an old cafe in Kiev, its wallpaper peeling in the corners, smoke curling from bitter cigarettes, and at a table in the back, a broad-shouldered man in a cheap suit stares at a napkin. He's not doodling. He's designing empires, smuggling routes, shell companies, the blueprint for a global underworld. And he hasn't even ordered tea yet. This isn't the flashy gangster with gold chains and car chases. This is Semion Mogilevich, the man who made the FBI squint, who turned Eastern Europe's collapse into a business plan, and who quietly built a criminal empire so large, so fluid, and so smart that even when the world knew his name, it couldn't catch up to his shadow. You probably won't survive this one, not because it's violent, but because by the end of it, you'll be asking yourself how many invisible hands like his are shaping things around you, and how many already have. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The cafe smells like dust, boiled potatoes, and burnt coffee. It's the 1970s in Soviet Ukraine, and young Semion isn't yet a criminal, at least not officially. He's still known as Seva, broad-nosed, heavy-set, with the kind of shoulders that look like they've never quite fit through a doorway without turning sideways. But beneath that bulk is calculation, and under the calculation, stillness. He's a young man who listens more than he talks, a trait that unsettles other men in this world of vodka bravado and hallway shouting, the kind of boy who watches a fight break out over soup and quietly memorizes what not to do. He grows up in Kiev in a time when the black market hums just beneath the crust of the system. Everyone's looking for things, jeans, cigarettes, foreign toothpaste, and everyone knows someone who can help. Seva watches. He learns. He doesn't chase glory in back alleys. He listens at the doorways of language schools, state offices, and currency exchanges. Many people still think his rise started with violence, with fists or fear. But really, it began with math. He studies economics at Lviv University. It's not glamorous, but it's strategic. While other boys dream of climbing ranks in street crews, Seva's eyes are on the numbers, on loopholes, exchange rates, the invisible flows of value across borders. He understands inflation before most Soviet citizens know it exists. His first real schemes aren't bloody. They're bureaucratic. Import-export licenses, slightly doctored invoices. He begins building a network, not of gangsters, but of quiet bureaucrats, customs officers, and factory clerks who can be persuaded with favors, cigarettes, or Western shampoo. His empire begins in whispers, not gunshots. By the late 1970s, he's running modest scams, nothing too risky, just clever. Jewelry trades, art pieces moved through friends of friends. He's not known as a boss, more like a whisper with a calculator. And even then, he doesn't flaunt money. He drives plain cars. He wears the same wool coat in every season. People don't fear him because of what he's done. They fear him because he knows what they've done. One of his earliest legends, still told quietly in certain Kiev backrooms, involves a customs official who tried to shake him down for a bribe. Seva didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He just asked the man how his daughter liked the new school in Warsaw. The official went pale. The bribe was forgotten. So was the conversation. He learns early that the real currency isn't money, it's information. And Semion begins collecting it with the quiet patience of a tax auditor with a long memory. He starts filing away everything. Who's sleeping with who? Who's skimming from which port? Whose cousin needs medicine only available in the West? And in a place where records are terrible, but gossip is priceless, Semion becomes a kind of ledger with legs. Still, he's not flashy. He's not loud. He builds in silence, and his silence becomes his armor. Even his enemies admit there's something unnerving about the way he walks into a room, like he's already seen the exit and written your name next to it. He doesn't drink much, doesn't gamble, doesn't flirt loudly. The classic Soviet gangster traits, Siva shrugs them off. But if you're a smuggler or a mid-tier politician, or even a lonely customs agent, you might wake up one morning to find that somehow you owe him a favor, and he never forgets favors. As the 1980s creep in, Kyiv begins to change. The cracks in the Soviet system widen. Corruption becomes less secret, more systemic. And Seva? He just widens his ledger. More names, more deals, more layers. One night, sitting in the same cafe, a contact slides him a piece of paper. It's not contraband, it's a shipping manifest. But Semion stares at it for a long time, then folds it gently. That document will eventually lead to a cargo route used for everything from diamonds to weapons. But tonight, it just goes into his coat pocket. Do you remember the day he sat with that first napkin? This is the same man. But now he's learned something more dangerous than any smuggling technique. Patience. That's what most people miss. Semion doesn't rush. He doesn't panic. He builds empires like puzzles, one quiet piece at a time. And if you ask the waiter who that man is in the corner, still sipping cold coffee long after midnight, he'll shrug and say, just someone who listens a lot, doesn't talk much, pays on time. The boy who once stared quietly through steamed cafe windows has grown heavier now, not just in body, but in gravity. Seva doesn't walk into a room anymore. He settles into it like something permanent has arrived. It's the early 1980s, and Kyiv is cracking beneath the weight of black market ambition. Seva isn't scrambling to keep up. He's drafting the next phase. It begins with weddings. Not his. Other people's. Quiet ceremonies arranged in back rooms and apartment kitchens between Soviets and citizens of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond. They're not real unions, more like economic loopholes in a tuxedo. These marriages create the perfect paper trail for relocation, for identity changes, and most importantly, for moving goods. Semion turns the wedding racket into an art form. His fingerprints are never on the bouquet, but he controls the guest list. With each ceremony, another route opens. Icons and oil paintings, silver cutlery, religious antiques, even bootlegged audio tapes of Western rock music, passed in hollowed books. He doesn't move the items himself. He moves the people who move the items. Layers of distance. He prefers it that way. Many people still think his genius was in what he smuggled. But really, it was how. Semion Mogilevich never saw borders. He only saw procedures. And procedures have cracks. He starts to create a model that will become his hallmark. Decentralize the crime. Centralize the profit. From small operations in Prague to diplomatic pouches in Budapest, The wedding ring becomes less a symbol of love and more a receipt for access. His nickname in certain circles? Koldovnik, the wizard. Not because of drama, but because he always seems to make problems disappear. Back in Kyiv, his network grows quietly. Seva doesn't operate from back alleys. He's often seen in libraries, art auctions, or government buildings, places where the truly dangerous learn how to behave like they belong. He builds shell companies through college classmates, accountants, bank clerks, even linguists who translate documents with small, fatal errors. Errors that slow investigations by years. He's begun acquiring taste, too. Not flashy, but deliberate. Hungarian wine, Polish suits tailored to look unremarkable, a briefcase filled with loose documents, and one heavy pen. He never carries a weapon. If things get tense, he doesn't reach for steel. He reaches for information. It's during this time that he makes his first meaningful international tie. In Vienna, he meets a man through a Ukrainian diplomat, a man with access to air freight and a fondness for porcelain. The meeting lasts 47 minutes, over mineral water and cold schnitzel. Nothing loud. But from that one handshake, a whole trafficking network through Austria begins. Cigarettes, religious artifacts, even uncut gemstones, all billed as used machinery in customs forms. Semion begins building something else now. Plausible deniability. He's always 2 steps removed from the crime, 4 steps removed from the cash. He doesn't drive the trucks. He doesn't handle the goods. But the man who does drive them now owes him a loan. And the cousin who prints the fake invoice? His wife just got a visa through Semion's fixer in Prague. The empire is no longer a napkin sketch. It's real, breathing, moving. One of the earliest signs of his growing reach is a customs scandal in Budapest. Authorities discover a trove of antique icons mislabeled as construction material. The suspects arrested are mid-level traders, their stories incoherent, their paperwork laughable. But none of them name Seva. Not because they fear him, yet, but because they don't know him. That's his design. If a man doesn't know the architect, he can't bring down the building. And so, Seva becomes a phantom in Eastern Europe's underground. He doesn't need to be in the room to be respected in it. People talk about him in quiet tones, not mythologizing, just describing. He's the guy who can get a crate through 3 borders and have it insured the whole way. The one who once arranged a visa, a baptismal record, and an oil painting sale in a single afternoon. At a smoky gathering in Krakow, a small-time smuggler brags that he knows Seva. He says this while toying with a cigarette and leaning back in a chair that doesn't quite support his weight. A few men laugh. One doesn't. The quiet one tells him, "If you really knew Seva, you wouldn't say his name like that." The smuggler doesn't come back to Krakow after that. Meanwhile, Semion starts testing something new: market manipulation. He's noticed how traders inflate prices of cigarettes in Slovakia. He realizes he can do the same, but across borders. Create artificial shortages. Buy out one supplier while flooding the other with counterfeits. It's not just about moving product now. It's about influencing behavior. Semion is learning that people, like currencies, can be manipulated in clusters. The Soviet Union is entering its decline, and for most, that means chaos. For Seva, it means opportunity. He begins hiring economists, not mobsters, people who understand models, trends, and leverage. He builds forecasts not for GDP, but for corruption markets. And that's when he discovers the holy grail of the post-Soviet criminal world, the counterfeit cigarette trade. Cigarettes are light, profitable, and addictive. They cross borders without suspicion. And best of all, you can make a product that looks identical to the real thing for a fraction of the price. Seva invests not in smugglers, but in printing presses, paper importers, and design firms that mimic packaging with chilling precision. He's not selling black market goods. He's selling parallel economies. Where one brand fuels taxes, his fuels empires. One former associate, speaking decades later, said, "He wasn't in the cigarette business. He was in the illusion business, and he was better at it than the state." By the late 1980s, Semion Mogilevich controls networks that span at least 6 countries. Yet, he still doesn't appear in police databases. His companies are all legitimate. His associates are vague. His hands are always clean. But if you look at the balance sheets of those who used to run things, those who vanished or retired suddenly, you'll notice something curious. Their assets didn't disappear. They shifted, quietly, neatly, into accounts that trace back to a holding company in Cyprus, a company with no website, no public office, and no listed employees, just one P.O. box, and one man whose name never shows up, but whose signature exists in margins, whispered through every deal. Semion Mogilevich didn't need violence to take Eastern Europe. He just needed a pen, a pattern, and a few men too greedy to read the fine print. It's 1990, and the Soviet Union is beginning to wheeze its final breaths. Borders are softening like warm butter. Currencies wobble with every rumor, and enforcement is too preoccupied with their own salaries to notice what's being loaded onto the night trains. While many are panicking, Semion Mogilevich is sharpening his edge. For him, collapse is just another form of clearance sale. By now, he's gone beyond smuggling and forgery. He's dabbling in systemic opportunity. While national banks stagger and state-owned assets dangle without protection, Seva quietly buys undervalued factories, trading licenses, and even regional export rights for commodities no longer tracked with competence. One of the first things he does is set up a network of accountants, real ones, trained in Western finance. He doesn't just want to hide money anymore. He wants to redefine it. The key move comes when he relocates more of his operations to Prague. It's a pivot point, still tethered to the former Eastern Bloc, but increasingly cozy with the West. In the Czech capital, he purchases a local art shipping company, a modest office above a bookstore, and a quiet residence on the outskirts with a garden that's always pruned but never visited. It's from this base that he launches a string of shell companies designed not just to launder money, but to legitimize it. That's the key difference between Semion and other mobsters. They wash money to make it disappear. He washes it so it can sit in a European bank and accrue interest. Every company has a purpose. One files invoices, another collects them. A third consults. A fourth exports stationery to Ukraine. None of them technically lie. They just imply things creatively. It's during this time he becomes known for his ability to fix failed markets. A textile mill in Slovakia, on the verge of bankruptcy, suddenly becomes solvent because Semion's front company secures them a mysterious contract with a buyer in Germany. The German buyer? A firm he also owns. The funds are real, the labor continues, and everyone signs papers they don't fully understand. Many people still think that Western Europe had no idea what was going on in these years. But so what do you think? Is it really possible that banks in Zurich, lawyers in Vienna, and brokers in London didn't suspect that the sudden influx of Slavic cash wasn't all from roses and wheat. But here's the trick. Siva doesn't just spread money. He spreads favors. That's a currency far more durable. He begins arranging for certain government officials to get spots for their children in foreign universities, for border agents to receive dental work abroad, for ministers to gain access to loans from off-the-books sources. All this through intermediaries, of course. No calls directly from the man himself. He's too busy tending to the growth of his next great innovation, the cross-border trade of counterfeit goods as part of state-level corruption. Take this. A truckload of fake Marlboros is intercepted in Slovenia. The packaging is nearly perfect, the tax stamps eerily precise. But there's no return address, no sender, and the driver insists he's just been paid cash to deliver. The trail leads nowhere, until, quietly, a lawyer shows up with documents proving the cigarettes were a donation to a veterans foundation. The case disappears. Behind that paperwork, a web of companies, all folding into a consulting firm that lists its registered seat in Cyprus. A firm that, like so many others, has no phone number, only a fax line that never picks up. This is where Semion truly begins to shine. He's not building an empire based on turf wars. He's building an infrastructure, one that outlasts any gang war, any regime change. While street-level thugs argue over territory, Semion is out there buying the company that leases the trucks. Back in Prague, the office above the bookstore is unusually quiet. But visitors come and go. Men in suits, women with briefcases. Not gangsters, financiers, accountants. Even, on occasion, former intelligence officers now in private security. Seva's not running a crew. He's running a committee. At one point, a former KGB operative, now freelancing for private clients, visits him for advice. He brings a problem about laundering a large sum tied to an arms deal. Siva listens, sips his tea, and then suggests 3 legal loopholes, 2 real estate flips, and a charitable foundation that could make the money seem clean within 9 months. The operative leaves, impressed. That night, he tells a friend, Mogilevich isn't laundering money, he's laundering reality. And the best part? No one's looking. Law enforcement is still catching up to yesterday's gangsters. Meanwhile, Semion is investing in tomorrow's. In 1991, as the Soviet Union finally collapses, Semion Mogilevich doesn't mourn. He expands. The power vacuum is like open pasture. He sends agents to acquire privatized assets, gas firms, steel operations, mining rights, all under different names, all buried behind real companies that file real taxes. He's particularly drawn to natural gas. It's not just profitable, it's strategic. Control the energy, and you control negotiations. He doesn't aim to be the face of it. He places himself behind proxies, oligarchs, politicians, business partners. He loans them startup capital quietly and always insists on a small cut of future profits. Years later, when some of those partners become billionaires and others are indicted, Semion remains largely untouched. Why? Because most people only know of him, not from him. Do you remember the textile mill in Slovakia? It's now churning out real product, but also used to move shipments for a firm in Belgium. That Belgian firm happens to own a cargo dock in Odessa. That dock, in turn, processes containers from the Middle East, some of which mysteriously vanish from paperwork before they reach inspection. But the only name that ever shows up? A mid-level manager who once met Semion at a business conference and thought he was just a quiet logistics consultant. Seva's footprint is enormous, but it's not loud. You don't find it by looking at crime scenes. You find it by tracing influence. He doesn't need to make anyone disappear. He just makes your attention shift elsewhere. And through it all, he keeps returning to Prague, to the office above the bookstore, to the apartment with the garden no one visits. There are rumors he walks his own security routes, always 3 steps behind himself, that he leaves notes for meetings but never attends them, watching from parked cars nearby, that he changes SIM cards like most people change socks. He doesn't talk much, but every once in a while, at a quiet dinner with trusted company, he'll murmur something like, "It's not hard to get away with things. It's just hard to stop getting away with them." And everyone laughs quietly, except one man at the table who realizes this wasn't a joke. It was a reminder. By the early 1990s, Semion Mogilevich is no longer just operating between Prague and Kyiv. He's threading the entire post-Soviet world together like a tailor of turmoil. As countries scramble to build parliaments and stock exchanges, Semion is calmly purchasing the pieces of chaos that everyone else is too disoriented to price correctly. His next play? Fake cigarettes. Real empire. On the surface, it seems laughable. Bogus Marlboros, cheap knockoffs of Camel Lights. But Semion doesn't laugh. He studies the profit margins. He maps out the customs policies. He realizes something others miss entirely. Fake cigarettes don't just offer untaxed income. They offer volume. You can pack thousands into trucks, pay off a single inspector, and make more money than most people see in a decade. And just like that, the Mogilevich Group becomes the silent heir to Eastern Europe's black lungs. Factories pop up in Hungary and the Czech Republic. Not filthy backroom operations, but actual industrial zones with leased equipment, mildly complicit managers, and paperwork that claims the plant produces construction adhesives or textile dye. But at night, shipments switch labels. Cartons become cartons, just with a different kind of paper inside. He doesn't smuggle them himself. He creates a cascade. One group makes the packaging. Another prints stamps. Another rents warehouses. And the last, well, they just move office supplies across borders. Semion's genius is in disconnection. No one piece can see the full picture, but they all run on his clock. And if something goes wrong, the fall guy is usually a man who met Siva only once and can't remember the name of the company he was technically working for. Around this time, in the suburbs of Budapest, a new compound begins construction. Locals think it's a foreign investor's retreat. Others whisper it's a private hospital. But those who really know, they say that's the hub, a place where roots are drawn, alliances are whispered, and passports are printed with better ink than the real ones. One evening, a diplomat from Serbia visits the compound for a business dinner. He arrives tense, suspicious. He leaves with 2 things: a generous loan from a Cyprus-based investment firm, and the quiet understanding that from now on, Semion's requests won't be treated as suggestions. And still, the West barely blinks. There are murmurs at Europol, yes. A few Canadian investigators raise eyebrows. But Mogilevich, he's not showing up in drug rings. He's not tied to murders. He's not leaving blood trails. He's just moving goods, filing taxes, and occasionally attending Eastern European art auctions in an ill-fitting blazer. That's when he strikes in Canada. Enter YBM Magnex International, a Canadian firm, publicly traded, with glossy brochures, a suburban Pennsylvania headquarters, and cheerful corporate branding. Its stated purpose? Industrial magnets, high-tech alloys, cutting-edge exports. And yet, behind the scenes, the executive offices are filled with men who don't seem to know much about magnets. Semion sits behind it all, rarely mentioned but always implied. He doesn't appear on shareholder calls, But he's the quiet, force-approving strategy, arranging investments, and, most importantly, pulling strings back to Europe, where the real cash flows begin. In just a few months, YBM becomes suspiciously profitable. Stock value climbs. Investors cheer. But then someone, likely an intern, as these stories often go, flags a financial anomaly. A shipping invoice that doesn't match inventory. A warehouse that doesn't seem to exist. One discrepancy leads to another, and soon the SEC is interested. So is the FBI. Many people still think YBM was the moment Western agencies finally started to see Semion. But again, so what do you think? Did they only start seeing him then? Or had they known all along, and simply not known what to do about him? Because here's the thing. Mogilevich doesn't care about arrests. He cares about timelines. By the time the FBI begins investigating YBM Magnex in earnest, Semion has already moved most of his assets elsewhere. Cyprus, Hungary, a little in Turkey, a lot in offshore banks under names that don't show up in any press coverage. He walks away with a smirk. The company collapses. Shareholders panic. Several board members resign and deny they ever met a man named Sava. But Semion, he's already sipping tea in Moscow, sketching new logistics lines on the back of a restaurant menu. Do you remember that textile mill? It's now leasing warehouse space to a supply chain firm that helps distribute luxury cosmetics to high-end boutiques. Except none of those boutiques actually exist. And inside the shipping containers, not mascara, just cigarettes, unbranded, untaxed, and wildly profitable. Semion's empire isn't criminal in the traditional sense. It's conceptual. Like jazz, it thrives in the spaces between the notes. And here's something no one likes to say out loud. Many of the governments chasing him, they're using the same loopholes, just with different paperwork. The line between mobster and minister in this era is thinner than a customs form, and Semion knows exactly where that line fades. His organization doesn't have a catchy name. No colors, no tattoos. But inside a dim-lit office in Budapest, behind frosted glass and a gold nameplate that says nothing meaningful, files are being updated. Phone calls are made in code. Every shipment, every forged invoice, every manipulated price feeds back to one ledger. A ledger only he understands. And every now and then, someone gets bold. A mid-tier trafficker tries to skim. A customs agent suddenly asks too many questions. A journalist requests an interview. They don't vanish violently. They vanish quietly. The journalist gets reassigned. The agent receives a promotion somewhere inconvenient. The trafficker, he's arrested, but for a completely unrelated charge in a completely different country, because Seva doesn't shout. He doesn't intimidate. He edits. And if you ask an old colleague of his what it's like to work for Mogilevich, they'll pause, look around, and say, "You don't work for him, you work through him, and one day, if you're lucky, you don't have to anymore." By the mid-1990s, Semion Mogilevich is not so much building an empire as maintaining an atmosphere. He doesn't just run operations anymore. He orchestrates a climate of quiet complicity. Whole economies seem to bend a few degrees when he adjusts his seat. His name still doesn't appear in the press, but his presence is unmistakable in the undercurrents of trade, real estate, and finance. And the scariest part? He's still not using violence. He doesn't need to. In Eastern Europe, where politicians are still figuring out how to hold press conferences without microphones falling over, Semion already has a better intelligence network than most ministries. His operation runs on 3 pillars: predictability, paranoia, and payoff. Everyone knows what they owe. Everyone suspects what could happen if they don't. And everyone somehow ends up better off. For now, in a smoky office in Moscow, he meets with a financier who complains about the unpredictability of commodity prices. Semion just smiles, leans forward, and explains how to use shell companies to hedge against that instability by causing it. A well-timed shipment delay, a whisper about an embargo, a forged news article planted in a local paper. Suddenly, copper prices jump, and his associate makes a small fortune. And Semion? He takes 2%, not of the profit, but of the method. He's selling strategy now, not product. He's a criminal consultant, the kind who prefers faxes to phone calls, and who always signs with a pen that leaves no indentation. It's around this time that Mogilevich begins forging deeper ties with Russian intelligence. Not officially, of course. That would be too crude. But many of his associates, bankers, logistics coordinators, customs specialists, once wore uniforms with eagles or stars on the sleeves, and many of them still take quiet orders from men in tall buildings. At least one FSB official is rumored to have dined with him weekly. The table was always set with tea, black bread, and silence. The deal was unspoken. You let me move my ships, and I'll let you steer the storm. Many people still think Semion worked for the FSB. Others argue the FSB worked for him. So what do you think? In a country where loyalty is leased and favors never expire, who really owns who? Meanwhile, his portfolio expands. He invests in publishing houses, not for ideology, but for layout. It gives him access to printers, translators, and distribution channels across multiple countries. A poetry anthology here, a technical manual there, and tucked inside, documents no customs agent will ever find, because they look exactly like the boring paperwork that no one reads. He dips into mineral rights, he funds port upgrades, he finances film productions, most of which never finish shooting. Each investment is another node, another excuse to move people, equipment, and money across borders. Everything he touches becomes both more legitimate and more opaque. And then there's Brighton Beach. While the West is still focused on Colombian cartels and Italian mafias, Semion begins quietly embedding himself in New York's Russian-speaking community, not as a kingpin, but as a benefactor. He funds community centers. He opens businesses that employ new immigrants. He offers legal assistance through intermediaries, all while sitting comfortably in Eastern Europe, speaking through emissaries whose names change monthly. And when those businesses grow, when their balance sheets begin to strain under scrutiny, a shell company in Budapest steps in and offers a friendly buyout, just enough to clear debts, just enough to take control. In one case, a Brighton Beach bakery is about to default on its rent. Within a week, they're bought out by a Bulgarian logistics firm. The new manager speaks no English, but shows up every morning at 6 a.m. with fresh ledgers and never asks where the flour comes from. The FBI begins to notice. Not loudly, not publicly, but internally memos circulate. Names begin to repeat. Flight records are quietly tracked, and one agent, based in Philadelphia, starts connecting dots that lead back to a peculiar firm in Canada. YBM Magnex. Do you remember them? Well, they're still under investigation, but the trail is slow. Every subpoena leads to paperwork that looks clean. Too clean. Executives have no idea what's going on. Investors claim ignorance. And Semion still doesn't have an official role, but the Philadelphia agent keeps digging. He assembles a task force. He interviews former accountants, some of whom seem genuinely relieved to be asked questions, until they realize who they were working for. The case grows teeth. Warrants are drafted. Surveillance begins, and Semion barely reacts, because by now he's playing with time, not risk. He understands that investigations move slowly, that bureaucracies have lifespans shorter than empires, and that as long as no single agency can pin everything to him, the whole thing remains vapor. Suspicion isn't an indictment, and suspicion, in his world, expires. He builds redundancy into every connection. Every company has a fallback. Every employee has an alias. Every ledger has a version that can be burned. Even his own aliases are rotated like passwords. In one quarter, he's a logistics director. Next, he's a cultural liaison. Then, a private equity advisor. In a Budapest bar, a disgraced banker once claimed he saw Semion buy a round for 8 men, all of whom introduced themselves under different names. At the end of the night, only one check was paid, and it was signed in Cyrillic by the bartender. That's what it means to be Mogilevich. Not to control everything, but to control the logic of everything. To make it so that anyone chasing you eventually finds themselves chasing themselves. Even when the FBI finally publishes a memo calling him one of the most dangerous criminals in the world, Semion doesn't flee. He just moves meetings to quieter hotels. He changes fax numbers. He retires one shell company and opens 2 more. If you ever wonder how a man like him sleeps at night, the answer is simple. He sleeps like the man who wrote the dream you're living in. It's a gray, damp afternoon in Manhattan when a press conference changes everything. The FBI, after years of whispers and wall maps filled with red yarn, finally utters the name, Semion Mogilevich. One agent, standing behind a podium that's slightly too tall, describes him as the most dangerous mobster you've never heard of. The room buzzes, reporters scribble, and a few jaws go slack. Dangerous? Russian? Never heard of him? Exactly, because that's the way Semion wants it. Notorious after he's done, not during. The memo leaks quickly. Headlines follow. Suddenly, his name becomes hot property in investigative circles. Journalists who'd never heard of him start piecing together years of obscure financial stories. A few European reporters even start calling old sources in Prague and Budapest, asking about this Mogilevich guy. But Semion? He's already somewhere else, not hiding, just shifting. Interpol places him on their most wanted list. Red notices circulate. Border patrols are notified. Some airports add his name to internal watch lists. But when you live in countries that don't extradite, and when your real passport isn't the one you use at airports, well, it's mostly just good theater. The world begins to learn about Semion's web of crime. Money laundering, arms trafficking, contract fraud, securities manipulation. But they're learning it in past tense. Because most of the companies involved have been dissolved, renamed, or absorbed into something seemingly respectable. Even the phone numbers listed in court filings no longer ring. They just click. Then silence. Back in Moscow, Semion reads the press coverage with amusement. Some quotes he highlights, others he laughs at. One particularly breathless article refers to him as the brain of the Russian mob. He underlines that phrase 3 times, then quietly tears the page out and burns it over a ceramic sink. There's no point saving things you already wrote yourself. He's careful now, but not afraid. In fact, this period, mid to late 90s, is when his legend starts to take on texture. Not just whispers in criminal circles, but stories told over dinner in hotel bars. There's the one about the arms deal he brokered between Balkan warlords and a Middle Eastern buyer using 3 translators. none of whom spoke the same language. Or the tale of the German banker who tried to extort him and was later found working as a ski instructor in Bulgaria, having voluntarily retired. Semion never confirms or denies these stories. He just smiles when they're told in his presence, and sometimes he'll correct small details. Not the crime, but the cutlery, the location, the weather that day. Like a novelist editing someone else's fan fiction, he's also becoming more domestic now, oddly enough. A partner to a woman whose name never appears in documents. She's rarely photographed, never interviewed. She once told a friend, "He's not a gangster. He just lives like one." Their home is minimalist. No piles of cash, no wild decor. Just tidy carpets, imported books, and a desk where Semion works in the mornings with tea and silence. His walls aren't covered in surveillance photos. They're bare, save for a single black and white picture of Kiev from the 1970s. The old cafe is still visible, behind 2 parked Ladas, and still, he works. Not like a man hiding, but like a CEO optimizing. He updates his shell structures. He retires agents who've become liabilities, sometimes with a handshake and pension, sometimes with a firm suggestion to disappear. He replaces them with younger faces, men and women who speak 3 languages and know how to balance a ledger by feel. Do you remember YBM Magnex? Its collapse was messy, but the money didn't vanish, it just pivoted. One of its sister companies, long ignored, quietly merges with a holding group in Luxembourg. That group buys a controlling interest in a Turkish shipping firm. That firm, in turn, acquires warehouse rights at a Romanian port. And that port, well, it just happens to be where counterfeit pharmaceuticals begin to appear 6 months later. Semion's genius isn't in avoiding crime, it's in making crime look like trade. Every scam folds into a spreadsheet. Every racket is backstopped by paperwork. One American prosecutor tries to build a RICO case around his financial trail. But the trail keeps splitting, like a river that doesn't care where it's going. Assets are sold minutes before court orders are filed. Bank accounts are drained in real time. Witnesses who were ready to testify now have no idea what they were ever shown. And the prosecutor? Burnt out. Relocated. The case is shelved. And still, Semion remains elusive. Even Interpol, armed with resources, files, and red highlighted names, admits they don't know where he is. Some say he's in Moscow, living in a compound with private chefs and reinforced walls. Others swear they saw him in Vienna last winter, walking alone down a foggy boulevard wearing a scarf that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Here's a curious moment. A former Mossad analyst once said, "We don't worry about Mogilevich because we don't understand his motive. He doesn't want glory. He doesn't want headlines. He just wants continuation, and perhaps that's the most unnerving part. He doesn't need to win. He just needs to persist." In a leaked recording, 2 smugglers argue over who controls a certain corridor between Belarus and Slovakia. One insists he has clearance from a man in Moscow. The other counters with a document allegedly signed by a friend of Siva. The argument doesn't resolve, but the shipment still arrives because Semion's name isn't a person anymore. It's a password, and if you ever meet someone who says they once worked with him, don't ask them for details. Just ask them how long it took to realize they were working for someone they'd never actually seen. If they say a while, you're probably hearing the truth. Somewhere in Vienna, a banker lowers his voice as he talks about a client whose portfolio doesn't quite match his tax returns. He doesn't mention Semion by name. He never would. But the tone shifts. The coffee cools. the conversation changes shape. Semion Mogilevich has that effect on people, because by the late 1990s, his reach isn't just vast, it's ambient, like moisture in the air. You don't see it, but it's everywhere. His name is rarely spoken aloud, but it hovers in side glances, in the pauses between sentences, in the names that never quite make it onto meeting minutes. And nowhere is this more evident than in Vienna. Austria has always been a curious middle ground, neutral in theory, but very accommodating in practice. For a man like Semion, who doesn't need a home, only a headquarters, it's perfect. Clean banks, quiet law firms, polite indifference, and most importantly, access to everything. Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Germany, Italy, even the Mediterranean if you know the right drivers. He opens offices under proxies. The signs are unremarkable. KMG Holdings, Vienna Business Solutions, Eurorail Trade Group. You've walked past them before. Frosted windows. A receptionist who always asks you to wait. Rooms full of paper that will never be read. Inside, Seva hosts meetings like a composer, adjusting sheet music, one visitor at a time. No one lingers. Each conversation stays in its own box, like a crime that doesn't know it's part of something bigger. But what's remarkable isn't what's said, it's what's not. Semion never discusses crime. He talks about margins, efficiency, branding, overhead. He rarely uses a phone. When he does, it's a burner device, handled with gloved fingers, discarded within the hour. Some say he writes notes by hand, then burns them before he finishes the tea, and he watches. That's the part most people miss. In Vienna, Seva spends long afternoons at cafes, not unlike the one back in Kiev. He sits quietly with newspapers in 4 languages. He pays attention to patterns, to phrasing, the way a German tabloid spins a banking scandal, the way a Hungarian outlet quietly buries a corruption report. He reads not for facts, but for rhythm, because rhythm tells you who's nervous and why. From these readings, he refines his investments. One day, he quietly purchases a controlling interest in a Latvian shipping firm that's on the verge of bankruptcy. The next, he offloads a chain of Hungarian real estate companies just before a property bubble bursts. It's not luck, it's design. And it's in Vienna that this design becomes dangerously elegant. He starts to layer his shell companies with cultural shields. That is, he makes them look too boring to investigate. A publishing company that only prints tourist brochures, a distributor of Orthodox prayer candles, a non-profit focused on Eastern European textile traditions, all of them staffed by real people, all of them technically above board, and every one of them connected, faintly, to a trail that begins in that smoke-filled Kiev cafe. Do you remember the wedding rings? The fake marriages and smuggled artifacts? Vienna is where that old strategy finds its final evolution. Now, it's not just goods or people, it's trust. He smuggles reputation. A company he once used for fraudulent tobacco shipments is repurposed to donate to a children's hospital. The press clippings from that donation? Pasted into the front of a new investor pitch deck used to attract EU development grants. That's not laundering money, that's laundering credibility. And in Vienna, it works beautifully. But Semion isn't content. His mind is already racing beyond Europe. The U.S. investigations are inching closer. The FBI task force in Philadelphia has made enough noise to warrant a pivot. So he starts reaching toward new markets. He builds bridges into Turkey, where smuggling is ancient, respected work. He rekindles ties in Cyprus, where money flows like sea spray. And he begins testing the waters in Israel, where immigration laws and offshore banking make for interesting experiments. It's in this period that Semion develops his habit of disappearing, not just from one place, but from sight. He'll be spotted in Moscow 1 week, then vanish for 3. He'll surface in Tel Aviv, then Istanbul, then reportedly in Caracas. Each time, different aliases, different hotel chains, but always the same touch: tea, silence, and a pen with no brand. Many people still think he had dozens of fake identities. The real number might be higher. In one leaked EU intelligence note, he's linked to no fewer than 27 different passports, many of which share only a birth date and shoe size. So what do you think? Can a man like that ever really be caught? Or do we only catch the outline he leaves behind? Vienna grows quiet after a while. Not because Semion leaves, but because he's mastered invisibility. His companies continue. His meetings happen. But his name no longer echoes. It's been folded in, like a spice in soup. You don't taste it, but it's there, changing everything. A lawyer in Vienna once said, "I don't represent Semion Mogilevich. I represent a trust that represents a fund that owns a company that used to take his advice." And then he smiled, like a man who had said too much and not enough. There's an apartment in Vienna, 3rd floor, corner unit, small terrace overlooking the Danube. No one lives there. The utilities are paid by a Croatian logistics firm. The fridge is always stocked. The sheets are always clean. And sometimes, in the early morning, a neighbor sees a light on, a shadow moving, a figure drinking tea. The curtains never open. Back in Moscow, the snow falls in sheets so heavy you can barely see the curb. In a city that once defined an empire, the silence now belongs to oligarchs and opportunists. But in a gated neighborhood just beyond the gaze of the press, Semion Mogilevich settles deeper into his new comfort. Visible to everyone, yet untouchable by all, he's come home, not in shame or fear, but in triumph. Moscow in the late 1990s is a different beast. The wildness of perestroika has given way to a new kind of order. Privatization schemes in Armani suits, business deals over borscht, and a generation of former KGB men now running security firms with nicer stationery. The mobsters of the 80s have either adapted or been buried. But Semion, he returns like he never left. Because technically, he didn't. His operations, long spread across Europe, now orbit around this re-established core. But this isn't the start of a retreat. It's the beginning of a rebrand. You see, in Russia, Mogilevich is no fugitive. He's not wanted. He's not even particularly interesting. Because in Russia, he's useful. There's a quiet understanding between him and the state. Not formal, not written, but very real. He doesn't make trouble here. And in return, he's free to conduct business, provided that business doesn't interfere with, shall we say, higher narratives. He purchases property in the city, a modest estate, nondescript from the outside, but within it, marble floors and a dining room with a conference table that could seat a war council. Staff move efficiently. No shouting, no drama. The only sign of wealth? A grandfather clock in the hall, its chime muted long ago. From this new center, Semion does something unusual. He starts hosting, every few weeks, a small gathering. Not parties, not even meetings, more like briefings. Attendees vary. Former intelligence officers, private bankers, European intermediaries, even once a visiting Georgian politician who, depending on who you ask, was either lobbying for infrastructure projects or asking for protection. The conversations never mention crime. They focus on risk, influence, and placement. And always with a whiteboard, never a phone. The windows are mirrored. The exits are planned. One guest, who later defected and gave a sanitized interview, described the mood as like sitting in the situation room, but with better snacks. Semion doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't issue orders. He simply listens. Occasionally, he taps the table once with a heavy finger, which means move on. Or twice, which means that's useful. He's cultivating something bigger than rackets now, a network of influence. He's no longer the man smuggling cigarettes across Slovakia. He's the man funding the infrastructure to decide which border guards will be working those posts 5 years from now. This is where Mogilevich becomes not just a mobster, but something else. A strategist of the state adjacent. He understands that in Russia, the line between public and private is blurry. So he learns to stand in the blur. Many people still think he held no official role in Russian politics. But again, what's official? So what do you think? Does power need a desk plaque? Or just a door that opens when you knock? The more Western agencies push for his arrest, the more Russia seems to shield him. Red notices go unanswered. Interpol complaints are filed, then disappear. At one point, an American official asks a Russian counterpart during a summit, "Why won't you hand him over?" The Russians reply, "Who?" The next day, Semion reportedly attends an opera. Second row. No security detail. Just him, a dark coat, and a gloved hand resting gently on the rail as Tchaikovsky swells. He's not hiding, he's anchored. From Moscow, Semion expands his reach into industries that don't appear in crime novels. Legal consulting, energy auctions, municipal construction bids. His name still doesn't appear on any paperwork, but his protege, often young, often sharp, always quiet, begins showing up in surprising places. One is appointed to a mid-tier role in the Ministry of Economic Development. Another becomes a director at a financial institution known for handling overseas capital. A third launches a startup that receives seed funding from a mysterious private donor connected to a law firm in Cyprus. They're not gangsters, they're infrastructure. He doesn't need them to break laws. He just needs them to define which ones matter. Do you remember that first napkin in the Kiev cafe? He's still drawing. But now the sketch includes policy, and then there's his presence in the Russian energy sector. Specifically, natural gas, Naftogaz, Gazprom, and the murky pool of intermediaries that rise and fall with every contract dispute. These are not places for amateurs. They're high-stakes, high-pressure arenas where state policy and black market convenience often flirt across the table. And somehow, Semion always seems to know where the contracts will land before the ink dries. At one point, a major energy dispute between Ukraine and Russia threatens to destabilize supply chains into Europe. Western analysts panic. Governments issue warnings. But a solution quietly arrives through a third-party firm with ownership ties that trace back to a Budapest address, then to a Cyprus mailbox, and then into fog. One journalist, braver than most, publishes an article alleging Semion Mogilevich as the silent hand behind the deal. The article is well-sourced, carefully written, and quietly buried within days. The journalist, reassigned, the news outlet, fined for unrelated licensing violations. The story, forgotten, because that's how Semion works. Not through confrontation, through repositioning. And at the center of it all is a man who rarely raises his voice, who prefers handwritten notes to emails, who still sips tea from chipped porcelain cups while the city swirls around him in a dance of distraction. If you saw him in Moscow today, you'd probably miss him. Not because he's in disguise, but because your eyes aren't trained to notice someone who doesn't want to be noticed. But if you did see him, He'd look at you just for a moment, not in anger, not in fear, just to check whether you were going to forget or remember. It begins with a whisper, a new name showing up in contracts in New Jersey, then Pennsylvania, then Florida. A man no one's ever seen in a boardroom is somehow signing off on freight insurance policies that move millions. The paperwork is clean. The signatures are consistent. The company's legitimate enough to fool even seasoned auditors. But behind it all, that unmistakable rhythm, disjointed names, circular ownership, and just enough misdirection to leave prosecutors blinking at spreadsheets like they've gone cross-eyed. Semion Mogilevich has arrived in America, not in person, not yet, but economically. His schemes, his structures, his philosophies of detachment, they begin to cross the Atlantic with a grace that customs could never trace. The 1990s are a wild time in Eastern Europe, but in the U.S., there's a different kind of opportunity. One built not on brute force, but on paper. He doesn't need to smuggle goods into America. He smuggles risk, repackaged in venture capital, rerouted through trust funds, and insured by companies that technically don't exist past the address of a lawyer's third drawer. One of his most ambitious moves is in Philadelphia, again through YBM Magnex. Yes, it's back. Not the firm itself, which collapsed under scrutiny, but the blueprint. Another shell rises in its place, this time marketed as a logistics and materials firm with export ties to Canada and Eastern Europe. Investors buy in, lured by promises of revolutionary magnetic technologies. The offices have whiteboards. The receptionists answer phones. The conference room even has one of those little glass water pitchers nobody actually drinks from. But of course, the core function of the business has nothing to do with magnets. It's a laundering operation, one so polished it looks like innovation. And that's the brilliance. The money doesn't hide in cracks. It dances under stage lights. At one point, a venture capital group in Chicago invests $8 million. The CEO visits the facility for a product tour and is shown a series of vaguely technical demonstrations involving spinning metal discs. He leaves impressed, but also confused. Years later, in testimony, he'll say, "I thought it was over my head. Turns out it wasn't anything at all." Eventually, the FBI gets wise. They send agents. Subpoenas start flying. Meetings get tenser. And one day, a quiet man named Lev, who handles day-to-day operations, gets arrested trying to board a plane to Montreal. Lev doesn't talk much, but what he does say starts to form a very interesting picture. And in the middle of that picture, a name that hadn't come up in the U.S. until now, Semion Mogilevich. This time, the Bureau doesn't sit on the intel. They release it. Boldly. Publicly. The phrase Russian Mafia hits American headlines with renewed vigor. Nightline runs a segment. 60 Minutes starts asking questions. Congressional subcommittees begin quietly gathering notes. Semion is labeled not just a mobster, but a strategist of transnational crime. The label sticks. It's scarier than a gangster, more insidious. He becomes the prototype for a new kind of villain. Educated, quiet, effective. A ghost with an accountant's patience. But here's the part they get wrong. They think he's operating from a distance, that he's far away, steering operations from Moscow or Budapest. And yes, he's there. But there are rumors, always rumors, that Semion has already touched American soil. Briefly, quietly. A business visa. A hotel suite under a name like Samuel Mayer. A coffee shop meeting near Brighton Beach. A dinner in Miami. Never long, never traceable, but enough to leave an echo. Do you remember Brighton Beach? The little neighborhood where he laid roots through non-profits and small shops, it's still part of the game. In fact, several businesses in the area now act as informal nodes in his network, not laundering money, just routing it. A real estate firm files for bankruptcy and quietly sells its remaining assets to a company in Panama. That company's director? A Ukrainian national who once managed a factory in Lviv owned by a holding group now defunct, but formerly funded by a Mogilevich affiliate. The chain is long, but the rhythm still unmistakable. And here's the terrifying thing for law enforcement. They can't find a crime. Fraud? Maybe, but it's cleverly packaged. The numbers line up, the taxes are filed, the losses are absorbed. The victims, when questioned, often say, "Yeah, I guess it was a bad investment. But I don't think it was criminal." And that's the heart of Semion's genius. He doesn't need to win every deal. He just needs the aftermath to feel like coincidence. At one point, a U.S. federal investigator, burnt out, cynical, but still trying, flies to Eastern Europe to meet a source who claims to have worked inside Semion's financial apparatus. The source shows up late, nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. He offers vague anecdotes, few documents, but one phrase sticks. Semion doesn't move money. He moves confidence. The investigator writes it down, underlines it. But he knows he can't charge anyone with that. Meanwhile, Semion, back in Moscow, hears of the agent's visit. He smiles, folds a document in half, and says to his assistant, "They're chasing the trail, not the logic." The assistant nods. He doesn't fully understand, but he's learned not to ask. And the empire continues, not as a monolith, but as a mist, settling into the cracks of globalization, bureaucracy, and greed. Banks unknowingly hold his money. Investors unknowingly chase his profits. Governments unknowingly build highways over ground he's already marked. He's not above the law. He's beneath its censors. And if you ever find yourself digging through a stack of financial records and you pause, confused, like something is slightly off, but you can't quite place it, look again. If there's a shell company that doesn't sell anything, if there's a contract with too perfect grammar but no signature, if there's an invoice paid 3 days before it was written, then maybe, just maybe, you're already inside the story. Somewhere in a Turkish port city, the kind with seagulls that sound more annoyed than free, a shipping container passes through customs with barely a glance. Inside, boxes labeled LED lanterns, home goods. Inside the boxes, vacuum-sealed cartons of counterfeit medication, perfect fakes down to the dosage. The paperwork traces back to a Serbian logistics firm. That firm is registered through a Bulgarian bank account. And the holding company? A modest entity in Cyprus with exactly one listed employee, a former translator for an import agency that closed 5 years ago. At the very end of the trail, nothing, just silence. Except the method is familiar. Semion Mogilevich is now playing at a level where even the products don't matter. Whether it's cigarettes, stolen art, energy contracts, or pills, it's the pattern that delivers profit. The crime is now in the infrastructure, not the item. And he's perfected it. By the early 2000s, he's scaled this method into something like a template for global black market capitalism. If you're a mid-level criminal with ambition, he's not the man who comes to collect. He's the man who teaches you how to invoice a bribe. His influence becomes translatable. There are whispers that Latin American cartels study his techniques for moving product without touching it, that Southeast Asian traffickers mimic his use of ghost companies to move money through respectable banks. Even West African cybercrime groups have been noted referencing the Russian style when discussing shell structures. And still, Semion Mogilevich doesn't appear in public. He doesn't post photos. He doesn't make speeches. He doesn't trend. He's like a source code that's been copied into too many programs to delete. Around this time, an international business conference takes place in Malta. A room full of energy traders, telecom investors, and mid-tier oligarchs circle each other like perfume-scented sharks. Among them, a quiet man in a navy blazer. He's introduced only as Mr. Marin, said to represent a Russian equity firm specializing in logistics transitions. He speaks little, smiles politely, doesn't exchange business cards. But 2 weeks later, 3 attendees sign contracts with firms linked to a network once connected to Semion's Budapest offices. That's how he moves now, not through orders, but through ripples. He even begins investing in companies that make compliance software. Yes, you read that correctly. A known criminal mastermind, at least known to those paying attention, is now backing firms that help governments and banks detect other criminals. One former Europol official joked, "If you use Semion's tools to find Semion, you're going to end up chasing yourself in circles." The brilliance isn't accidental. By embedding himself into the compliance ecosystem, he creates an internal fog. His own systems blend into the ones trying to detect systems like his. And while law enforcement tries to keep up, Semion explores new markets. Cryptocurrency, for one. He doesn't jump into it like a hacker or a kid with an online wallet. No, Semion treats crypto the way he treated cigarettes and artwork, as leverage. He doesn't try to get rich off volatility. He uses it to build untraceable liquidity. His proxies begin investing in blockchain firms, not for coins, but for access. A Ukrainian startup gets seed funding through a tech accelerator in Tallinn. The founder gives a TED Talk. The platform launches. Then, without much fanfare, a new feature appears, a payment routing function that allows users to shuffle small transactions across dozens of wallets. Claimed purpose? Privacy. Actual purpose? Obvious. 2 months later, that startup is sold to an Estonian fintech firm whose board includes 3 people who once worked at a Cypriot bank that handled transfers for a Semion-linked energy firm in 1999. That, my friend, is not conspiracy, it's consistency. And here's where it gets murky. At the same time, rumors swirl that Semion may be playing both sides, not just evading governments, but consulting for them. He knows too much, has mapped too many systems. In an age of cyber warfare and money tracing, who better to advise a government agency than the man who designed the blueprint for hiding money? Many people still think he was offered informal immunity by one major world power, but no one can prove it. So what do you think? Can a man become so useful that it's safer to keep him working than to shut him down? What's undeniable is this. Mogilevich no longer runs crime. He licenses it. A new generation of players, the sons and daughters of former Soviet hustlers, the crypto rich, the offshore bankers with clean shoes and dirtied palms, still move within structures Semion designed decades ago. His name may not appear, but his fingerprints are everywhere. Not literal ones, of course. He doesn't touch things, he just arranges them. One anecdote, told quietly in a cafe in Bucharest, a customs official receives a bribe envelope. Not unusual. But inside, along with the money, is a note. From the man who made your cousin's visa possible. The official goes pale. He never mentions it again. Semion doesn't need to threaten, he reminds. And in this era of encrypted messaging, automated surveillance and financial data lakes, he's become something even more elusive. A ghost in the algorithm. Somewhere, there's a server in Liechtenstein with files so complex, the programmers themselves can't untangle them. At the bottom of one directory, a digital folder titled Inventory. Open it, and it's empty. But behind the encryption, if you know the key, you'll find exactly what you're looking for. Nothing and everything. A cold wind blows through a gas station just outside Kiev. The pumps are quiet, the lights flicker, and somewhere beyond the edge of the lot, a black SUV idles with its headlights off. Inside, two men speak in low tones. One holds a USB stick. The other doesn't ask what's on it. He just asks if the route through Moldova is still open. He receives no answer. He already knows, because when you operate in Semion Mogilevich's world, answers aren't handed out. They're calculated. By the early 2000s, Semion is no longer merely a figure within Eastern Europe's underworld. He's become a variable in geopolitical math. Any regional disturbance, any change in tariff law, any unexpected resignation of a customs official, somehow, somewhere, Semion's name is mentioned. Not as the cause, as the constant. He's particularly present, if not in person, then in influence, through Ukraine's energy sector. The lines between business, politics, and organized crime are already blurred in this field. But Semion? He's the smudge on the lens. His name comes up repeatedly in discussions surrounding Naftogaz, Ukraine's national gas company, and its Byzantine network of intermediaries, investors, and, let's just say, external consultants. The European press tiptoes around it. Ukrainian papers allude, with nods and ellipses. And Western analysts? They try not to sound paranoid while drawing lines between the names. One of the most persistent questions in policy circles becomes, how much of Ukraine's gas flow is controlled by Semion Mogilevich? The answer is difficult, not because no one knows, but because everyone suspects too much. And then there's the Vienna connection again. Do you remember the quiet apartment with the Danube view? That address now shows up in documents filed as part of an Austrian energy holding company. This company, in turn, holds a percentage of a Cypriot firm that leases storage facilities in Odessa. And in Odessa, gas isn't just a commodity, it's leverage. Here's how it works. Gas is bought, or appears to be, by a front company, heavily discounted due to favorable political ties. It is stored in facilities leased by a third company owned by no one, registered in Belize, funded through a bank in Latvia. The gas is sold again at full market price to European clients, sometimes even back to Ukraine itself. Everyone profits. No one signs their real name. And somewhere along the way, a small fraction of each transaction disappears into accounts whose passwords are known only to one man. Semion doesn't manipulate these deals directly anymore. He doesn't need to. He simply trained the people who do. He owns the process, not the product. And when these arrangements begin to unravel, usually due to Western scrutiny or a government shakeup, Semion isn't caught. He's already gone, several steps ahead, reviewing reports on his quiet estate in Moscow, sipping tea while a fireplace crackles softly behind him. One evening, a journalist gets close. Very close. He receives leaked documents showing money trails that appear to tie Semion directly to a gas intermediary accused of bribery. He plans to publish. But the day before the piece is scheduled, his editor pulls it. No explanation. No discussion. Just a quiet, we've decided not to move forward. The journalist quits. He goes to work in real estate. He doesn't write about gas again. And that's how Semion handles problems. Without touching them, people shift, circumstances bend, stories dissolve. He also begins to play a more active role in political shaping, not through ideology, but through pressure. Semion isn't interested in parties or policy. He's interested in outcomes. He funds campaigns indirectly, supports certain mayors, buys land near infrastructure zones before votes are even cast. In one case, He's rumored to have influenced the appointment of a deputy transport minister, not by bribery, but by facilitating a loan to a relative who just happened to be in a position to apply pressure. The deputy, when interviewed years later, simply said, "I don't remember who helped, but I knew who I didn't want to disappoint." That's Semion's real talent. He creates environments of compliance, not through threats, through inevitability. And then there's the gas for weapons rumor. It's an old tale passed around in dark corners of European intelligence circles. The story goes like this. A nation in the Middle East needs weapons, discreetly. A former Soviet arsenal has what they need, but no one wants to be traced. So, a deal is made. Natural gas is shipped at favorable rates to a third country, which in turn sells energy to another front, which provides arms under the table. Somewhere in the middle of this chaos, a signature appears, never on the same document twice, but always in the same ink. Some claim that Semion orchestrated the whole thing from his villa outside Moscow. Others say he only blessed it. Still, others insist it's a myth. But here's the question. If a criminal genius engineers a deal so complex that no one can prove it ever happened, did it happen? So what do you think? Because that's where Semion operates now. Not in facts, but in doubt. In a world built on assumptions and incomplete data, he thrives. And even as Ukraine becomes the focus of international politics, with revolution brewing and government shifting faster than seasons, Semion stays calm. He moves some money, changes some names. He meets with former associates, never more than once a year. He makes suggestions. He lets other men carry out the details. His name rarely comes up anymore, but his shape does. A Swiss banker describes him like this. You don't see him, but you feel when he's part of something, like someone has rearranged the air in the room. And when a foreign intelligence officer is asked during a hearing if they believe Semion Mogilevich is still active in Ukraine's gas trade, the officer pauses, then says, "Define active." In the spring of 2008, just as global markets begin to tremble and whisper of something darker coming, Semion Mogilevich makes a rare misstep. He becomes visible. It happens in Moscow, in broad daylight. A well-dressed man, heavy-set, slow-moving, exits a car near his estate. He's flanked by two plain-looking bodyguards in gray coats. There's no drama, no rush, just the clack of polished shoes on stone and the sharp, surreal moment when uniformed officers approach. They don't yell, they don't draw weapons, they ask calmly, "You are Mr. Mogilevich?" He smiles. Of course, they arrest him, just like that. The most elusive figure in international organized crime walks into custody like he's been waiting for an appointment. The charges? Tax evasion. Not money laundering, not racketeering, not decades of whispered financial manipulation. Just unpaid taxes. A technicality, and perhaps that's the point. Many people still believe the arrest was staged, part theater, part message. So what do you think? Was it justice in motion or a controlled detour? He's held in a Moscow detention center, the kind where the tea is bitter and the walls hum with forgotten names. But Siva isn't panicked. He reads. He walks. He speaks politely to guards. One source claims he receives more visitors in custody than most cabinet ministers do at their desks. Journalists salivate. Western media recirculates his name. Interpol stirs. Old FBI files are dusted off. Suddenly, the world remembers the man they couldn't quite catch. But back in the holding cell, Semion seems, by all accounts, serene. And just when international pressure seems poised to rise, when prosecutors begin to mumble about extradition and foreign cooperation, something strange happens. He's released, Just over a year after his arrest, Russian authorities announced that the case has insufficient evidence and that he is no longer being held. The response from the West is a collective blink. Wait. What? He's free? Yes. He walks out the front door, coat folded neatly over his arm, a file of papers in his left hand, and disappears into the gray morning light like a man finishing an errand. Do you remember the earlier whispers? The ones about protection, usefulness, timing? They seem a little louder now. Following his release, Semion Mogilevich steps deeper into shadow than ever before. No more interviews, no photos, no public statements. Just silence and a few transactions that feel familiar if you squint hard enough at the data. He retreats, reportedly, to a large estate outside Moscow, same one, some say, that he never actually left. There, behind tall fences and opaque windows, he continues something. No one is certain what. Some say he's retired. Others insist he's shifted to meta-management, consulting for a new class of criminal syndicates. Not as a boss, but as a strategic ghost. One thing becomes clear. He is no longer running organizations. He's mentoring architects. His fingerprints begin to appear in unlikely places. A real estate boom in Montenegro, suspiciously fueled by capital from consulting groups with no public portfolios. A satellite telecom project in Central Asia, backed by investors with opaque histories. A casino in Cyprus that changes hands 4 times in 18 months. All through paper companies tied to the same key of tax address. The logic is pure Mogilevich. Distraction, disconnection, and depth. Nothing illegal on the surface, but underneath, currents that smell of compromise. Around this time, the FBI quietly removes him from their 10 most wanted list. No announcement, no press release, just gone. A curious journalist calls to ask why. The Bureau replies, the case no longer meets the criteria. And what are those criteria? They don't say. In a hotel lobby in Istanbul, 2 businessmen sip dark coffee and talk in low tones about that old key of man. One of them mentions that he once received an invitation to a dinner with Seva, but declined out of nervousness. The other man smiles and says, "You didn't decline. You were never invited." That's how far Mogilevich has slipped from legend into infrastructure. He's no longer the center of the story. He's the grammar. His empire now exists in shadows cast by other people. He doesn't make decisions. He anticipates them. Doesn't call meetings. He sends signals. Entire operations pivot because a single assistant tells a partner that Seva's tone was different this week. In the absence of sightings, mythology blooms. They say he walks the garden alone now in the mornings, wearing a heavy robe and mumbling softly to himself that he plays chess against himself, not for strategy, but as meditation, that he owns a server farm in Belarus, from which he occasionally monitors world markets, not to profit, but simply to confirm that the logic he built still holds, that he once burned $1 million just to see what the sound reminded him of. Do you remember the quiet in Vienna? The mirrored windows? The soft click of a closing door? That silence wasn't the end. It was a prologue, because even now, Semion Mogilevich isn't hiding. He's listening. A Ukrainian investigator once said, "You don't find Semion Mogilevich by chasing him. You find him by chasing something else and realizing he's been sitting there the entire time." And perhaps nowhere is that more true than in the strange, quiet corners of Europe's financial hubs. Places like Luxembourg, Zurich, and the Isle of Man, where fortunes shift without hands, and companies are born and buried before lunch. Semion has evolved. By the 2010s, he's not operating like a criminal at all. He's become something rarer, something more permanent. He is influence made flesh. He doesn't break laws. He bends them into furniture. legally structured entities, offshore havens, family trusts, layered ownership agreements. This is no longer about hiding money. This is about making money irrelevant. One of the most telling indicators of this shift happens in Liechtenstein. A small bank, no larger than a few floors above a bakery, processes a peculiar sequence of wire transfers. Each transaction is modest, perfectly timed, and always tied to cultural organizations, art foundations, literary awards, music schools. But when a junior compliance officer adds the numbers, he notices something strange. All the recipients are real, all the transfers are legal, but nearly every beneficiary has also, at some point, received a different kind of payment from defense contractors, agricultural exporters, or telecom speculators. It doesn't add up. Unless, of course, someone is laundering influence, not just cash. And somewhere at the center of that orbit, an equity trust established in 2001, directed by a name known only to those who once worked at a now-defunct Hungarian logistics firm, which, of course, used to pay consulting fees to an accountant who, 2 decades ago, helped manage shell company books in the old YBM Magnex offices. It always comes back around. Many people still think Mogilevich's genius was in escaping arrest. But no. The real brilliance lies in how he made every layer of his exit strategy double as a new business model. So what do you think? Could your retirement plan survive decades of scrutiny and still pay out clean? Because Semion's has. He begins to appear, indirectly, in gray zones. Those twilight industries no one quite understands, but everyone wants in on. Data storage in Eastern Europe, crypto mining ventures in the Caucasus, rare earth mineral plays across ex-Soviet republics, each one dotted with unusual ownership patterns, familiar phrasing, and board members whose CVs seem too boring to be real. At one point, a Chinese conglomerate buys a majority share in a Slovak energy supplier. A quiet footnote in the deal. One of the legal advisors formerly worked for a Cyprus-based consulting group founded by Samuel Mahler, a name with no passport, but plenty of history. The trail fades as always, but the shape, unmistakable. And yet, Semion's personal life during these years remains a mystery. Those who claim to have seen him speak of a man slower now, heavier, but somehow more deliberate. His walk purposeful, his greetings short, his eyes scanning constantly, not with fear, but calculation. It's said that he keeps a single folder in his study, labeled only Archive. No one knows what's in it, but the staff don't ask. One of them once opened the drawer it sits in and found the smell of old tobacco and something like photocopied ink. They never opened it again. He keeps strange routines, sleeps during the day, works at night, walks in loops around his compound. Sometimes he's seen speaking to no one, as if rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet. In Moscow, he's more ghost than man. The state doesn't touch him. Foreign journalists leave him alone. And younger criminals? They refer to him in reverent tones, not out of fear, but because he represents a kind of success they can't replicate. Not with guns, not with Instagram, not with bribes. One night, during a quiet dinner in a rooftop restaurant, a Russian financier jokes that Mogilevich is like the grandfather of deep state capitalism. The table laughs, but then the waiter approaches and says, without smiling, "That man doesn't like jokes. No one knows how he heard." In the world of crime, most bosses age out. They lose touch. They make mistakes. They die in cars or courthouses or villas built too loudly. But Semion Mogilevich didn't age out. He aged in. He grew into the void, like ivy on stone. Even intelligence agencies, those long haunted by his name, begin to change their approach. One NATO analyst suggests internally that Mogilevich be treated not as a criminal target, but as a geo-economic phenomenon. Another proposes a think tank study titled The Mogilevich Model: Stateless Influence in the 21st Century. Neither paper is published. Do you remember the question? Where is Semion Mogilevich? It no longer matters, because his location is a misdirection. His empire isn't defined by territory. It's defined by design. And if you look hard enough, at a funding contract, at a change in ownership, at the architecture of avoidance, you'll find him, not standing in the frame, but behind the camera, adjusting the lens. A rain-damp afternoon settles over Budapest, the kind that blurs the glass and slows the trams. Near the old Parliament building, a woman in a dark coat steps into a modest office lobby and signs in. She's a lawyer, or an accountant, or both. She asks for a specific file by number, an archive request, nothing unusual. The clerk retrieves it. Inside, 20 pages of financial disclosures from 1997. But tucked into the back, a single business card, no name, no phone number, just a logo, a chess knight, silver against matte black. She stares at it for a long time before sliding it into her folder. That logo, whispered among a select few, is said to be the final evolution of Mogilevich's brand. Not a company, not a front, but a signal. A private seal used to mark operations he deems fully mature, autonomous, durable, capable of outlasting attention. Semion himself is said to have retired, again. But even in retirement, he doesn't disappear. He simply delegates the ghost. What he builds now are systems of continuity, not for one man or one crew, but for entire generations of activity. Offshore companies once dissolved are quietly resurrected under new names, sometimes run by people who have no idea they're part of a legacy network. Banks are used not for hiding, but for timing. Bribes become grants. Blackmail becomes cooperation. Every crime is converted into protocol, and at the heart of it all, a philosophy. Not ideology, not greed, but asymmetry. Semion no longer plays offense or defense. He simply moves differently. In 2013, a whistleblower in Austria releases a cache of documents linking several respected law firms to Eastern European consultants with deep ties to long-shuttered industries. Among the files is a memo referencing the archive, an encrypted set of documents believed to contain financial playbooks from the late 90s to the early 2010s. The memo is unsigned, but the formatting, the phrasing, the precision, it screams Semion. It's not just that his influence lingers, it's that his style has become viral. Young syndicates in the Baltics begin mimicking his practices. Instead of drug running, they buy into logistics chains. Instead of laundering cash through casinos, they fund IT startups with artificially inflated valuations, then funnel the proceeds back through venture liquidation. The press calls it innovation. The old guard calls it Siva's shadow. Even in Asia, his reach is speculated, not through direct ties, but through behavioral resemblance. An Indonesian palm oil firm suddenly backs out of a massive infrastructure deal when it's discovered their corporate structure leads to a Cypriot nominee who once worked for a Budapest courier company. That courier, of course, was wound down in 2002. But the postal license used to file taxes in its final year? It's been reactivated under a new address, one with no signage. Everywhere you look, it's footprints with no body. And just as the West begins to pivot toward new threats, cybercrime, global kleptocracies, the slow fusion of state and syndicate, Mogilevich becomes less a man and more a case study. Universities begin teaching his methods in risk modeling courses, Think tanks draft reports with his initials blurred, not out of fear, but out of reluctant admiration. An unnamed source in London's Financial Crimes Task Force once confessed, "Honestly, I think he beat the game. Because he didn't win with weapons. He won with calm. Do you remember the apartment above the bookstore in Prague? The one where his empire matured? That address now houses a co-working space for startups. Young entrepreneurs sit exactly where Semion's men once forged shipping manifests and cleaned cash. But the Wi-Fi routers are still registered to a trust that pays rent 3 months in advance from a bank account in Malta. There's a poem in that. As for Semion himself, he is rarely seen. Once in 2016, a tourist in Moscow posted a photo online of a man on a park bench feeding pigeons, heavyset with sharp eyes and hands too still for leisure. The caption? "This guy looks like a Bond villain." It's quickly taken down, the account deleted. The bench? Empty. Many people still think he lives in seclusion, surrounded by books, memories, and a dwindling circle of trusted aides. Others say he's working on a memoir, not for publication, but as a record of where the pieces landed. So what do you think? Can a man really fade while his mechanisms grow stronger? Because Semion Mogilevich may never walk into a courtroom. He may never be tried, or sentenced, or confronted. But if you ever uncover a discrepancy so elegant that no one questions it, if you find a deal so layered that no one dares unwind it, if you trace a name through 5 jurisdictions and end up right back where you started, then maybe, just maybe, he's already welcomed you to the board, and you're 3 moves behind. The room is dim, not dark, never dark. Semion Mogilevich does not operate in shadows. He operates in low light, where edges blur and details fade just enough to make the truth malleable. There's a calm to the setting. Thick drapes, the tick of an old wall clock, a pot of tea cooling beside unread newspapers printed in 3 languages. Outside, Moscow breathes in low gray tones. Inside, Seva thinks. Not fast, not slow, just deliberately. He no longer deals with the day-to-day. That was never his strength. The real work, the architecture, the scaffolding of control, that's where he thrives. He has notebooks filled with sketches and margins, phrases like buffer zone equity and ownership elasticity. These aren't criminal notes. They're design theory for a world built on avoidance. There's a new rhythm now, one of slow reassessment, of transition. In the last few years, he's begun to withdraw, not from power, but from visibility. The systems he built are self-sustaining. His name no longer appears even in rumor, and when it does, it's often preceded by phrases like used to or was believed to. Past tense, as if the ghost is aging out. But aging, for Semion, has never been decline. It's refinement. He walks less, speaks less, trusts fewer. His circle is barely a circle anymore, more like a tight coil, a spiral of names bound by unspoken contracts and mutual longevity. The loyalty he commands isn't out of fear or charisma. It's out of the stability he represents. He doesn't need to punish betrayal. No one dares the entropy. Even now, every quarter, a courier arrives. Always the same briefcase. Always the same route. The contents? Reports. Not just financials, but behavioral summaries. Data on market shifts, sanctions, political reshuffles. But what Semion reads most carefully are the patterns. The parts that hint at systems changing course, at power decentralizing. And what he does next is never reaction. It's accommodation. He adapts faster than most systems because he doesn't announce the adaptation. He just does it, silently, like a draft document saving in the background, A few years ago, someone asked whether Mogilevich's influence had finally waned. The answer came not in words, but in a contract dispute between two major logistics firms in Warsaw. One side withdrew without penalty. The other declared bankruptcy. A month later, both firms were acquired by a holding company with no board, no public statements, and a familiar structure. One that looked an awful lot like a design Siva had drawn up in 1996. Coincidence or callback? He's become a template now. A figure to whom younger players compare themselves. A name used not to scare, but to measure. This move feels Mogilevich, they say, when a scheme runs too clean to be accidental. Do you remember the journalist who vanished? The startup that failed upward? The customs agent who got promoted right before an investigation collapsed? Semion doesn't cause these events anymore, but he wrote the syntax they follow. And now, in the gentle closing rhythm of his career, he becomes something gentler still, a whisper among operators. He doesn't need to be consulted. His precedents are the consultation, and in this silence, he finally finds peace. Not the peace of safety, not the peace of absolution, but the peace of a man who knows he has nothing left to prove, so he keeps the curtains closed. He stops traveling. He walks his garden path with a cane now, silver-handled, carved with the outline of a chessboard knight. He nods to the house staff, occasionally hums an old Yiddish song, and takes calls less and less. When asked once what he regrets, he reportedly smiled and said, "Only that I don't get to see how the rest of the machine works without me." And then he chuckled, because that's the final twist. It probably will work without him, and it probably already is. So now, as the rain settles outside your window, or the fan hums gently in your room, maybe you're beginning to feel it. That soft descent into quiet. That loose thread of a world both real and just beyond reach. The story lingers, but the urgency fades, like distant traffic or the last flicker of a candle. Semion Mogilevich. A name, a legend, a blueprint. He walked through decades not with noise, but with notes, each one arranged carefully, like keys on a piano only he could hear. He didn't build an empire on terror. He built it on paperwork, patience, and the slow erosion of attention. And maybe, just maybe, the most dangerous man in organized crime was never the loudest voice in the room. Maybe he was the quiet one, the one who waited until everyone else had said their piece, and then rewrote the ending. So, as you let your body sink into the mattress, your eyes heavier now, let the final traces of that world slip out of frame. No more names, no more numbers, just stillness. A mind at rest, because even ghosts have to sleep, and maybe tonight you'll dream not of fear or conspiracy, but of a man in a garden, tracing invisible lines in the air, with no one watching but the breeze. Good night. The hallway smelled faintly of polish and printer ink. In an office block near the Moscow River, 3 men sat around a table littered with espresso cups and legal folders stamped with names like Vostok Timber Holdings and Novatech Freight Management. None of them spoke loudly. None of them said the word Semion, but everything on that table belonged to him, or had once. Because now, in this quiet phase of his empire, Semion Mogilevich doesn't need to own things outright. He just needs them to remember where they came from. This is the Vienna chessboard, his long game in full motion. Back in Austria, the apartment above the Danube remains shuttered. But elsewhere, in the first district near the old stock exchange, meetings take place every Thursday at a law office that doesn't list its name on the building directory. The men who enter aren't criminals, not technically, They are advisors, trustees, former diplomats turned consultants, and occasionally, someone from an energy firm with forward-looking exposure in post-transition economies. What binds them is the structure, a shape that Semion perfected and left behind like a recursive code. The outer layers look like legal compliance, tax efficiency, smart investment. But underneath, the quiet hum of transactions designed to never quite land anywhere solid. One of the newer players, young, slick, educated in London, asks a question too loudly during a portfolio review. So wait, are we actually profiting from this firm in Montenegro, or is it just a buffer? There's a long pause. Someone nods toward the window. The younger man quiets down. Because even now, years after his last known public appearance, Semion's rules apply. You don't ask for clarity. You infer from continuity. And continuity is what this whole section of the empire is about. Do you remember the gas for weapons deal? The ghost signatures? That logic lives here too, just with new tools. These days, Semion's proxies play in sovereign bonds, development grants, and soft influence operations. One firm claims to fund humanitarian infrastructure in Central Asia. Another lobbies for EU environmental certifications for offshore shipping. Neither has offices. Both pay taxes. All documents are correct. In one case, an NGO receives a $1.2 million donation from a Luxembourg trust. They use it to expand a recycling center. The funding is real. The work is done. But later, investigators realize the trust also quietly purchased land beneath a nearby logistics hub 2 months earlier and flipped it to a shell company at triple the value. All clean, all legal. But the mechanism, that rhythm again. Semion doesn't need to touch these deals anymore. The Vienna network does it for him. He built something too elegant to dismantle because it looks like something respectable. That's the stroke of genius, not to escape detection, to eliminate the desire to detect. Many people still think Vienna is where he hid out during pressure from Interpol. But so, what do you think? What if Vienna was never his refuge? What if it was his canvas? And then there are the chess moves, those subtle reshuffles of property, license, or leadership that realign power without anyone realizing it's happened. In 2017, a mid-sized gas firm based in Slovakia undergoes a routine restructuring. Shareholders change, no headlines, but buried in the footnotes of a compliance report is the name of a director, German national, previously affiliated with a holding firm registered in the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man company dissolved 2 years ago. But prior to that, it leased back office services from a consultancy in Cyprus, the same one that appeared in a forgotten Budapest freight case from 2002. The director himself? A former chess champion. Coincidence? Maybe. But Semion once said, in business, randomness is just structure you haven't noticed yet. In this late stage of his chessboard strategy, Seva doesn't think in years. He thinks in cycles, political ones, legal ones, media ones. He knows the pendulum of global attention, and he's timed his moves so that every time it swings toward him. The documents have already expired. He doesn't win by evading capture. He wins by eroding the question. One Viennese banker, still working under secrecy agreements, described the post-Mogilevich economy like this. It's not that he left behind a network. He left behind a climate, a way of breathing. Once you breathe it, you never go back. And if you ever sit in one of those Thursday meetings, sip bitter espresso, and glance at the folders on the table, you'll see it too. No logos, no blood, just calm paperwork. And behind it all, the outline of a man who knew when to stop being seen. If the Vienna chessboard is where Semion Mogilevich perfected the quiet art of control, Then Moscow is where he learned to build foundations out of favors. And as the 2010s roll on, one thing becomes clear. He doesn't just understand systems. He cultivates the people who run them. By now, Siva isn't chasing money. He has plenty. He's not chasing influence either, not directly. What he's doing, methodically, is installing allies into places where rules are written. He's not bribing officials anymore. That's far too crude. Instead, he's backing trajectories. A young economist with an eye for privatization strategies. Semion funds her graduate research through a third-party academic foundation in Belgium. A mid-tier bureaucrat struggling with medical bills. A health assistance grant appears, tied to an NGO advocating better benefits for civil servants. None of them receive a phone call. None of them meet Seva. But 5 years later, when that economist is appointed Deputy Minister of Trade, and the bureaucrat now oversees foreign investment approvals, the phone still doesn't ring. They just know. This is Semion's new empire, not built on threat, but on remembered kindness. In a smoky office in Sofia, a retired intelligence liaison flips through old case files, now declassified. He pauses on one. A series of strange transactions involving consulting payments to a non-existent maritime advisory group. We thought it was corruption, he says, but now I think it was planting seeds. Semion plants more than seeds. He plants templates, structures so efficient that new players, some of whom have never heard his name, naturally fall into them. A consulting firm in Georgia processes payment for trade data that never arrives. A logistics center in the Baltics runs slightly over capacity and under scrutiny. Each of them copies a model traced back to Semion's playbook, sometimes word for word. And then there's the laws. Semion never wrote legislation, but he's influenced more than a few. Tax exemptions that benefit shell corporations, trade agreements with loopholes perfectly shaped for transshipment fraud, banking reforms that shift scrutiny from transaction origin to purpose. An easy thing to fabricate when you own the ledger, the accountant, and the audit trail. A Latvian MP is caught in a small scandal involving a shadow trust. The trust traces back to a firm once controlled by an Estonian businessman who lived for years in a Budapest apartment. The very building that used to house one of Seva's first false export agencies. One journalist starts following the trail. He's meticulous, sharp. He publishes a piece titled "The Man Who Taught the Law to Forget." It garners attention, briefly. Then he's offered a job, an international reporting fellowship. Better pay, better reach. He takes it. The story ends there. So do the follow-ups. In Moscow, Seva reads the article. He doesn't laugh. He just underlines the title and whispers, "Almost." Many people still think he uses blackmail to get what he wants. But that's outdated thinking. Semion's moved on to something softer, something more effective. He creates conditions where loyalty becomes self-preservation. Imagine this. A mid-tier oil executive is caught between signing a deal with a foreign partner or rejecting it on national security grounds. He's unsure. Then, a quiet dinner. A recommendation from a friend to speak with an older consultant who knows the terrain. The consultant says little, just mentions that his firm once worked on a similar deal years ago, and that the fallout was expensive. The executive signs. The consultant is never seen again. The deal flows upward. You see, it's not threat that drives decisions anymore. It's gravitational pull. Semion once described his work like this: "I don't build pyramids. I build inclines, gentle ones, so people don't notice they're sliding." And slide they do. Back in Moscow, in that quiet study where the curtains are always drawn, Seva reviews the monthly reports. One assistant reads them aloud. Another tracks financials. A third handles correspondence, which rarely needs response. The decisions made here, soft as they may seem, will shape appointments, derail prosecutions, reroute investments, and quietly cancel investigative budgets. And all of it will look natural, because in the world Semion Mogilevich built, the most efficient form of power is the kind that looks like coincidence. A nondescript diner on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Laminated menus, too much ketchup on every table, and a waitress who pours coffee with a mechanical flick of the wrist. At a corner booth, two men sit quietly. One wears a cheap blazer and a wedding ring that doesn't quite fit. The other wears wire-rimmed glasses and chews his toast too slowly, like he's tasting every vowel of a conversation not yet spoken. They're both FBI, and they're watching a third man at the counter. The man's name is on a file marked Operation Toehold. It's 2009, and the Bureau is running out of patience. For years, they've traced fragments of fraud, shell companies, and money movement through the East Coast, from Brighton Beach to Miami, from Queens to Toronto. And at the center, or maybe behind the center, is a man they still haven't touched, Semion Mogilevich. This time they think they're close. The plan is simple in theory. Bait a known associate into a controlled deal involving fake securities and laundered cash. Let him lead the Bureau through a tangle of transactions, then follow it all the way back to the spider's web. It almost works. The associate, a businessman with dual citizenship and a surprisingly poetic way of describing offshore accounts, plays along. Wiretaps are installed. Meetings are held. A warehouse in New Jersey is secured for surveillance. Everything starts to unravel when a wire transfer, scheduled to prove intent, bounces before it's even sent. Why? Because the bank account used by the front company had been closed the day before. Not by the feds, by the company itself, which of course wasn't supposed to exist at all. Do you remember YBM Magnex? This is its spiritual sequel. Except, this time, Semion doesn't need to be in the building. His ghost is enough. The systems work without him. The people involved don't even know they're using his legacy. And the FBI? They're chasing a protocol that updates faster than they can investigate. The Philadelphia field office is frustrated. One agent calls it chasing a crime written in pencil that erases itself every quarter. They file memos, they request support, they get it for a while, and then slowly the funding fades. The manpower is reassigned. A key analyst retires. Another moves to cybercrime. And like so many attempts before, the trail cools. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Seva stirs honey into his tea. His phone never rings, but his assistant walks in and says, "Philadelphia stood down." Semion doesn't react. He already knew, because this wasn't just about evading arrest. This was about testing system pressure, seeing how far the U.S. would go, what resources they'd commit, what they'd miss, and most importantly, how long it would take before they gave up. Many people still think the FBI failed to arrest Semion because they couldn't find him. But so, what do you think? What if he was always findable, just never reachable? Back in Brighton Beach, several businesses are shuttered. A seafood importer closes. A bookstore goes online only. But a new company opens, a digital freight management firm offering AI-enhanced custom support. Their LLC paperwork is flawless. Their first invoice is paid on time. Their first client? A logistics company from Slovakia. The chain? It loops quietly back to a man who once managed trucking manifests at YBM Magnex in 1996. This is Semion's American strategy. Not dominance, not violence, just presence. Lingering presence. The type that remains in systems long after names have been scrubbed. like humidity after a storm. In Washington, a retired intelligence officer gives a lecture to a graduate seminar on organized crime. He ends his presentation with a slide, a blurred black and white image of Mogilevich. "You don't fight a man like this with force," he says. "You fight him with stamina. And good luck finding any government that has that anymore." The class is silent. Then someone raises a hand and asks, "So, is he gone?" The officer pauses, then smiles. "Gone? He's not gone. He just doesn't need to show up anymore." Rain brushes against a frosted window in a quiet Moscow neighborhood. Behind it, a kitchen glows low with amber light. Semion Mogilevich sits alone at a table, reading an outdated policy journal, its spine cracked and margins filled with his underlines. He's not looking for news. He's looking for rhythm, for change, because by 2020, he knows the world has begun to mutate again, not in obvious ways, not coups, not shootouts, not regime collapses, but in subtler forms. Digital finance, sanction layers, AI-enhanced fraud detection. Governments are adapting faster. But so is Siva, because while the world scrambles to keep pace with innovation, he only ever focused on one thing: structure. And structure, once understood, can be repurposed, even modernized. That's how Semion begins his quiet fourth act. As a distant architect of networks no longer criminal in appearance, but built on inherited logic. These aren't mobsters. They're technocrats, venture capitalists, international consultants. They wear blazers with no wrinkles and quote UN reports when applying for tenders. But many of them, once funded, trained, or nudged into relevance through his long shadow. Here's one example. In Kazakhstan, a government-backed startup wins a bid to create a decentralized logistics platform using blockchain. The founder is 28, educated in London, speaks 6 languages. The platform launches, raises money, expands. Then, quietly, it sells part of its infrastructure to a holding firm in Malta. That firm, it turns out, is owned by another firm in Cyprus, which owns partial shares in a Dutch data privacy company, whose founding advisor, never listed publicly, once handled the tax structuring of a now defunct Budapest shell company specializing in commodity arbitrage. That company was, in 1995, 2 degrees from Semion Mogilevich. He doesn't need to touch the code. He wrote the logic. Back in Russia, the world grows louder. Social platforms explode. Financial regulators adopt algorithms. Western banks retreat. And somewhere beneath that noise, a counter-movement begins. A trend of returning to basics. Quiet trust. Analog habits. Paper trails, not digital. Real face-to-face loyalty, not encrypted messaging apps. Save us smiles. It's as if the world has come back to him. Do you remember the apartment in Vienna? The one where meetings were held one visitor at a time? There's now a mirror apartment in Tbilisi. Same layout, same furniture, same soundproofed walls. The leaseholder is a young woman who runs a non-profit focused on cultural preservation. She gives tours, hosts grant writing workshops, and once a month, she receives a visitor. Always alone. He stays no more than 15 minutes. Carries a briefcase. Never signs in. This is post-visibility Semion, the one who doesn't move through systems, but beneath them. He's no longer relevant to public criminal investigations. He doesn't appear in task force briefings. Most agents under 30 haven't even heard his name. But in global shipping data, in property acquisition chains, in obscure lobbying contracts and real estate trusts, his outline still flickers. A financial reporter in Zurich stumbles on an interesting pattern. A set of asset flips between 2014 and 2019 involving Baltic fishing rights, all routed through a logistics firm whose internal language is curiously outdated. invoice schema resembles post-Soviet accounting logic, she writes in a notebook. She digs deeper. A few too many coincidental mergers. One too many nominee directors with blank social histories. The trail leads toward a pension fund in Russia, oddly capitalized. Before she can publish, her paper is acquired by a media conglomerate. Her editor shifts her to a new beat, green energy. The fishing story is shelved. Back at his kitchen table, Siva folds the policy journal shut. The fire has dimmed. A cup of tea sits untouched. His assistant enters quietly. The Georgian project submitted their quarterly report. All normal. Semion nods. What about Cyprus? They declined the audit. But the banking partner, Zurich, cleared the compliance gate. He says nothing. Just reaches for a pen. Draws a small X on the corner of the tablecloth. A signal only the assistant understands, because power, at this stage, is not about command. It's about momentum that doesn't need steering. Seva is no longer the mastermind of criminal plots. He's become the memory of mastery itself. And that, as it turns out, is harder to kill than legacy. The snow in Moscow has a way of making everything feel paused, like the city's breathing through a filter. Semion Mogilevich steps carefully along a narrow garden path, his cane tapping rhythmically against the cobblestone. The trees are bare, the air is crisp, and every movement he makes seems chosen in advance, as if the world might skip a beat if he steps wrong. But he never does, because at this point in his life, everything Siva does is choreography. Inside, on a small desk near the window, sits a laptop, new but heavily modified. It's used once a week, always on Fridays, and only to check on what he's not supposed to see. Contracts that don't list his name, reports that don't mention him, foundations that were never publicly associated but feel familiar. He reads silently, not for content, but for tone. And occasionally, something catches his eye. A phrasing too precise, a number too clean, a silence that doesn't quite ring true, and he smiles, because even now, people still use his methods without knowing it. In 2021, an international task force on illicit financial flows is launched, funded jointly by several EU nations. Their aim, to uncover invisible wealth migration networks and name the key players. A year into the investigation, they find dozens of suspect firms, questionable trusts, and cross-border partnerships designed to confuse regulators. And behind one of them, buried beneath 5 layers of entities, a familiar name appears. A dormant courier service based in Budapest, same one from 25 years ago, still filing taxes, still active, still untouched. Seva doesn't need to defend himself from these investigations. He anticipated them years ago. His current systems operate on the assumption that scrutiny is inevitable. They are built to look suspicious, but be useless to pursue. Somewhere, a team of interns in Brussels spends 6 weeks unraveling a network that ends in a fishing cooperative that's owned by a charity that doesn't exist, but pays taxes anyway. The final report concludes with, insufficient basis for criminal referral. Recommend policy reforms. In other words, we found the ghost, but we can't prove the haunting. Meanwhile, Siva is planting something new. He's no longer interested in logistics, or oil, or even gas. Now it's digital jurisdiction. The places where data becomes power and sovereignty blurs into bandwidth. In Eastern Europe, several small countries begin offering citizenship by investment programs. One such nation sees a sudden uptick in applications from obscure tech founders, startups that exist more in slide decks than code. Each one funded through a VC firm registered in Malta, which, if you remember, hosts that shell company connected to the Slovak blockchain logistics platform. And the VC firm? It quietly hired a compliance officer who previously worked for one of Siva's first post-Soviet export businesses. Full circle, but no fingerprint. Semyon's role in these plays is no longer executive, it's almost theological. He is a belief system whispered through legal memos and consulting calls. Keep the structure 3 layers deep. Never own what you can influence. Always make sure the last man in the chain has a clean face. An American intelligence analyst, new to her department, stumbles across a reference to an Eastern European investment group whose portfolio behaves oddly, consistently losing money, but somehow always acquiring more assets. She prepares a short report and presents it to a senior officer. He listens, nods, then asks one question. Do you know who Semion Mogilevich is? She hesitates, Googles him, finds a Wikipedia page that reads like a cautionary fable, and realizes she's just seen his shape. Many people still think Seva's power came from his knowledge of crime. But the truth? His power came from his understanding of bureaucracy. He knew that systems don't collapse, they metastasize, that once you teach a machine to forget, you no longer need to delete yourself. And that's what he's become now. Residue in the firmware of global finance, a forgotten patch, a function that runs even when disabled. Back in the garden, he finishes his walk. His coat is heavy, his breath short, but his steps remain even. A guard nods as he enters the house. No words, only rhythm. There's a room in Semion Mogilevich's estate no one talks about, not out of secrecy, but reverence. It's small, lined with shelves of old briefcases, yellowed invoices, outdated passports, and a filing cabinet that doesn't lock anymore. Inside that cabinet sits a row of handwritten ledgers, not digital backups, no scans, just thick, ink-drenched paper curled slightly at the corners. He calls it the Quiet Archive. He visits it once a month. Alone. Door closed. No guards. Just the soft rustle of documents that haven't seen daylight in decades. These aren't evidence. They're anchors. Memory-encoded formulas for how to break a system without anyone noticing until they're standing in rubble. And now, in his twilight, Seva isn't just preserving records. He's curating them. Outside this room, the world spins faster. The pandemic restructured borders, rewired economies, and digitized dependency. The speed of fraud has multiplied. Entire scams now execute in milliseconds. But Seva, he's slowing down. Not because he can't keep up, but because he doesn't need to. He already saw this coming. In 2022, a series of shell companies begin quietly acquiring data centers in Eastern Europe. Not massive ones, small, regional facilities, often on the verge of bankruptcy. They're brought under the umbrella of a cloud optimization trust registered in Jersey. Each center's internal structure is upgraded, staff replaced, servers leased, often at a loss. But then the pattern emerges. These data centers aren't profitable because of storage. They're valuable because of location, proximity to election infrastructure, telecom switches, and undersea cable stations. And the legal firms managing the acquisitions? Several show indirect ties to legacy logistics groups, one of which, still technically active, was co-founded by a Mogilevich affiliate in Budapest in 1993. That's how he plays now. Not in control, but in proximity. He doesn't touch the data. He just ensures it passes through buildings he once diagrammed on napkins. A cybersecurity think tank releases a white paper warning of ghost infrastructure embedded in critical European networks. Privately held companies with no technical reason for their influence, but strategic positioning so precise it suggests design. The authors imply foreign state actors. They never mention Seva, but one of the authors receives a handwritten note a week later. Unmarked envelope. plain paper. 7 words. You notice the pattern. That's enough. He never speaks of it again. Meanwhile, Semion sits in a leather chair by a frosted window. His assistant updates him. The Belarus data node was acquired through a proxy. Legal structure held. He nods, adds nothing. Instead, he pulls a small notebook from his coat and writes a date. Just a date. Nothing else. Then returns it to his pocket. The assistant knows not to ask. In the wider world, governments grow noisier. Anti-corruption campaigns swell. Asset freezes become press releases. Oligarchs scramble. Names hit sanctions lists like falling dominoes. But Seva, his name never shows up. Because while others built empires, he built a language. And as long as that language survives, in server contracts, in crypto trusts, in how mid-level financiers explain complex movement, he exists. Not alive, not dead, just active. A former Europol director once said, off the record, "We didn't fail to catch him. We failed to define what he was, because Seva stopped being a man long ago. Now he's a method, a grammar of corruption, an unseen punctuation mark at the end of deals too complicated to read aloud." In the quiet of his home, Seva finishes reading a file. He sets it down, reaches for an old scratched cassette recorder. He presses play. A recording of rain, soft and unsteady, begins to fill the room. He leans back, not planning, just remembering how the first sound of power feels somewhere in Montenegro. In a villa built into the cliffs above the Adriatic, a transaction takes place that technically never happens. No contracts are signed. No money visibly changes hands. But a man leaves with a key, and another man makes a call to a bank in Liechtenstein. And just like that, a shipping port becomes part of Semion Mogilevich's orbit again. Not owned, not managed, just available. This is Semion's latest weapon, non-ownership control. A method perfected not with muscle or menace, but with whispers and structures so dense that even lawyers squint when they try to understand who, exactly, is responsible for anything. And it's not just ports anymore. It's soft territory. The in-between places where law meets custom, where sovereignty is negotiable, where favors outweigh policies. In the Balkans, a luxury development project received surprise investment from an Estonian fintech group. That group is managed by a consultancy headquartered in Vienna. The consultancy was founded by a Moldovan national with no known background, except, of course, a brief stint in the 90s managing freight invoices out of Budapest. Do you remember the freight firm? Of course you do. This is how Seva operates now. By residue. A sequence of events, a list of board members, a set of transfers that mean nothing unless read together. And even then, only if you already know what you're looking for. He doesn't touch the money. He touches the logic, and logic has no borders. One of his few remaining visitors is an older man, once part of an intelligence agency, whose name no longer appears in headlines. He comes every few months. No agenda, no formal reports, just conversation. At dinner one evening, he asks, "Do you miss the noise?" Semion doesn't respond right away. Then, softly, "I miss being underestimated." They drink in silence after that. Back in the villa in Montenegro, the port begins processing container shipments for a Turkish textile group. All routine, all compliant. But one shipment each week moves through faster than the rest. Always pre-cleared. Always insured through a brokerage in Cyprus. The manager of the port says he doesn't know who authorized it. He only knows it happens. And that is, of course, the point. Meanwhile, in Dubai, a property fund is launched targeting Eastern European diaspora investment. Its seed funding comes from an Emirati firm backed by Swiss advisors. None of them ever mention the quiet shareholder, a Luxembourg trust connected to a Vienna private equity firm with legacy structures resembling, well, by the time anyone looks closely, the assets have already moved. The money's been walked, not sprinted. Every step legal, every step soft. Many people still think the game now is cybercrime, Bitcoin thefts, ransomware, flash scams. But Siva? He plays a slower game. He doesn't break digital systems. He creates analog gaps around them, places where trust still trumps code, where a handshake still matters more than encryption. One such handshake takes place at a private art gallery in Vienna. Two men meet in front of a painting by a forgotten Soviet surrealist. They nod, exchange portfolios. One leaves with a folder that contains a simple 6-word memo. Approval confirmed. No digital trail necessary. The gallery owner never sees the exchange, but a week later she receives a grant from a cultural preservation nonprofit, funded by a trust registered to an address in Prague. Yes, that address. Semion by now is less active than he once was. His walks are shorter, his meetings more selective, but his reach hasn't weakened. It's simply matured. He doesn't want new empires, he wants insulation, protection not from prosecution, but from irrelevance. He's lived long enough to see his name fade from most databases. And yet, when serious people talk in serious rooms about the untouchables of organized finance, they lower their voices and say, "There's still the old man, of course. They don't need to name him. Everyone already knows." Back in Moscow, his assistant hands him a package. Inside, a note, a ledger, a photograph of a man Semion hasn't seen in 30 years. He studies it, then folds it, then says, "Tell them I'm still watching, but not interfering." And with that, another cycle completes. He doesn't need to act, because his past actions still echo loud enough to answer the door. The office in Prague doesn't look like much, just another nondescript workspace with frosted glass, beige walls, and a receptionist who chews gum like it's her job. But in the back, behind 2 layers of quiet, sits a meeting room with no decoration at all. It's rented twice a month by a consulting firm that changes names every 6 months. And once every quarter, a man enters carrying nothing but a notebook. He stays for 1 hour, leaves with no fanfare. Inside that notebook, margins filled with dates, initials, and city codes. It doesn't need explanation, only recognition, because if you understand the format, you understand the command. Back in Moscow, Semion Mogilevich sips tea made from leaves brought by hand from a hillside garden outside Tbilisi. He doesn't drink for taste. He drinks for ritual. Everything now is ritual. The morning review, the briefings, the quiet. He's no longer strategizing, he's sustaining. A strange thing has begun to happen in financial intelligence circles. A new pattern. Firms from seemingly unrelated sectors, logistics, agro-processing, private security, are all showing matching governance structures, unusual board rotations, directors with almost no digital footprint, and every now and then, the exact same bylaws, down to the comma. One junior analyst at a Nordic watchdog flags it. She's curious, persistent, sharp. Her supervisor listens, then says gently, "That sounds like a Mogilevich imprint. Old school, elegant, no proof." She writes a report anyway, circulates it quietly. 3 weeks later, she gets a job offer from a consultancy in Dubai. Triple the pay. She takes it. The report. It dies in a folder marked, "Too complex for immediate action." Do you remember the old CIA term? Plausible deniability. Seva didn't just adopt that. He engineered a version where even he is deniable, where people work for systems that mirror models he once designed, where no one says his name, yet still unconsciously follows his logic. In 2023, A bank audit in Romania reveals an internal compliance tool sourced from a vendor that went bankrupt in 2011. But the tool's code was updated last year. When questioned, the bank shrugs. Legacy integration. Nothing malicious, just a ghost in the software. And yet, hidden in that tool's audit log is a routing behavior. Reroute flag on account if linked to specific corporate IDs. Corporate IDs registered. Back in Budapest, 1996. Yes, again, Seva watches the news sometimes, but only in the morning. Global unrest, political theater, tech billionaires tweeting about ethics while investing in surveillance. He shakes his head. So loud, he mutters, so temporary, because that's what he's avoided. Noise. His world is still, because stillness is hard to trace. Stillness doesn't trigger AI detection. Stillness isn't newsworthy. Stillness survives. Many people still think that Semion Mogilevich is retired, that he's old, done, faded into irrelevance. So what do you think? Because when a private airstrip in Slovakia quietly changes ownership to a fund with no public face, and that fund's registration matches the formatting of a Mogilevich-era offshore group, is that retirement? When a Mexican security firm opens a regional logistics arm in Eastern Europe, managed by men who never answer questions directly, but always reference former best practices, is that fading? When a Hong Kong fintech app suddenly hires a compliance director who once managed shell exports in 2002 and whose non-compete is still somehow honored in 3 countries, is that man gone? In truth, Semion doesn't need to operate anymore. He just exists in design. He's the blank space in flowcharts. The variable you remove from the math problem because it's too old to matter, except it's the only reason the equation balances. He doesn't build new networks. He leaves instructions in the bones of old ones. At night, in that silent office by the garden, he listens to a cassette of wind moving through dry grass. It's a copy of a copy, fuzzy, imperfect, but the memory is intact. He closes his eyes and lets the pattern run without him. The old hotel in Bratislava no longer takes guests. Officially, it's being renovated indefinitely. But 3 times a year, its top floor lights up for exactly 1 night. No public bookings, no staff posted. Just 1 key holder and 1 guest. Always different guests. Always the same guest room. Room 704. Inside that room, no deals are signed. No names exchanged. But a very particular kind of business takes place. The kind that depends not on language, but on memory. One guest brings a need. The other offers a map, not a solution. Never that direct. Just the terrain. Guess who designed the map? Mogilevich has entered his most elusive form. Presence without proximity. He doesn't make decisions. He just makes decision-making predictable. The people who cycle through that hotel, they've never met him, but the methods they use, the way they build shells, the pacing of asset movement, the rhythm of concealment, they all come from a playbook that hasn't been published, but is still read aloud in certain rooms. Do you remember when Seva said, "The best crime is just a misunderstood transaction"? Room 704 specializes in misunderstandings. In 2024, a wave of cryptocurrency collapses sends governments scrambling. Forensic auditors pore over thousands of wallets, shell exchanges, private keys, and bridge contracts. Some projects are scams, others genuine. But a few, they lead to addresses in Prague, then to telecom firms in Cyprus, then to asset custodians in New Jersey, one of whom once managed real estate accounts for a logistics group dissolved in 2004. Again, the shape reappears. Never named, always known. The term Mogilevichian starts to circulate in hush among mid-level analysts. It's not formal, not academic, but it means something. It means a structure with no clear owner, a company that never breaks laws, only bends them in patterns, a trust whose only purpose is to exist exactly long enough to become boring. In this context, Mogilevichian is not a criminal label. It's a design compliment. Back in Moscow, Siva's assistant updates him on the Bratislava activity. It went as planned, no trace. He simply nods. Then, in a rare moment of indulgence, he speaks. You know what the difference is between ghosts and architects? The assistant shakes his head. Ghosts haunt the past. Architects design rooms that people don't know they're in. He doesn't smile after saying it. He just pours another cup of tea. At an international conference on anti-money laundering, a keynote speaker warns of non-state influence networks with high-level sophistication and historic roots. One slide flashes names of known financial criminals. Semion Mogilevich's name is not included. But later, at the bar, two delegates trade knowing looks. One says, "Funny how the most dangerous ones don't even get mentioned anymore." The other raises a glass, because they built the rules everyone else breaks. This is where Seva now lives. Not in geography, but in the policy blind spot. In every clause that was designed to catch the last generation of crime. But not this one. He's proof that the future doesn't always belong to the fast. Sometimes it belongs to the thorough. Many people still believe that Semion Mogilevich's empire collapsed years ago. So what do you think? When a London arbitration firm drops a case because the plaintiff's funding source was too complicated to untangle, when a legacy accounting tool still contains a module named for a warehouse inventory format abandoned in 1998, when a shell company is deactivated and another with the same director is created exactly 48 hours later in a different country, is that collapse? Or is that just how the script continues? Outside, a soft snow begins to fall. Seva steps onto the balcony. The air smells like coal smoke and pine. He breathes deeply, not in nostalgia, but in confirmation. He has become the background process. The script that runs not because it must, but because no one's figured out how to turn it off. In the hush before dawn, Semion Mogilevich walks slowly through the old orchard behind his estate. The trees are crooked with age, their bark brittle, branches gnarled. They don't bear fruit anymore, but he keeps them anyway. Not for produce, but continuity. Each step crunches lightly on frost-laced soil. A blackbird stirs. Somewhere far off, a truck backfires. He doesn't flinch, because at this stage, nothing startles him. He's outlived rivals, regimes, and relevance. And yet, somehow, he's still relevant. Not in the way tabloids once portrayed. The most dangerous man. The phantom Don. The shadow brain of the Russian mob. But in a far quieter sense. As the template that modern corruption consults when uncertainty arrives. Inside, his assistant prepares the weekly digest. It's a curated summary, not news. A hedge fund director in Toronto stepped down after a failed audit. A shipping license in Varna changed hands overnight. A lobbying group in Brussels re-registered under a new NGO. Most people wouldn't connect them. But Seva? He sees the through line, and then, halfway down the report, a single sentence makes him pause. Interpol has archived the Mogilevich watchlist file. He blinks, not in surprise, but in recognition. Because it had to happen eventually. He sets the file down, walks to the quiet archive, pulls the bottom drawer, takes out a cassette labeled only Yugoslavia 1988. He plays it. A conversation, grainy, his voice, younger, stronger, calculating. If they ever stop watching, he says, it means the blueprint worked. And it did, because power isn't about being seen. It's about being built into the furniture. He was never interested in headlines. He wanted settings. He wanted defaults. And now, decades after his supposed decline, his style, his method, remains default. One last audit report passes through a compliance team in Singapore. It notes an unusual transaction pattern in a port logistics company. The pattern resembles a now defunct freight model, once employed by a Budapest operation that hasn't existed in 2 decades. The analyst writes, "Very old school, possibly unintentional mimicry, but whoever designed this knew what they were doing." He flags it. It's ignored. Too vague, too historic, too familiar. So what do you think? Did Semion Mogilevich ever really vanish? Or did he simply graduate from presence to pattern? Many people still think about him as a criminal, but history may record him differently. As an architect of untraceability, as a strategist whose greatest skill wasn't hiding money, but hiding motive. Not a ghost, not a relic, but something far more enduring. A system-made man. And in the end, as dawn finally arrives over the rooftops of Moscow, Semion doesn't watch the sunrise. He just closes the curtains, returns to his chair, and listens to silence. Because the work is done, the echoes are enough. The night has grown long, and the rhythm of this story has softened into memory. You've walked through tangled corridors of global finance, brushed past figures who never give their names, and stood quietly behind the man who never had to raise his voice. Semion Mogilevich's world wasn't built on noise. It was stitched from silence, precision, and the slow erosion of attention. And now, as our time with him ends, the pace begins to ease. Let the echoes fade. Let the documents return to their drawers. Let the ledgers close without signatures, and the briefcases stay latched. The patterns will continue without us. And that's the beauty of designs that last. So if your eyes are heavy now, if your breath has slowed, then perhaps you're ready to leave behind the blueprints and drift into something softer, somewhere with no paper trails, no secrets to file, and no need for control. Because sleep too is a system, and right now, you're invited to disappear into it, quietly, deliberately, like a master of vanishing who no longer needs to be remembered to remain. Thanks for staying with me.